Hey there, guys. All right, today we are back with some more overly sarcastic productions, and this time one that I've been excited to get to, Trope Talk Cursed Artifacts. Now, before we dive in, make sure you go and check out the links in the description box below. I would love it if you joined the Discord and followed me over at Twitch. Now, Cursed Artifacts, this actually may be an episode I don't talk much in, purely because I have found that on the trope talk videos that I consider to be tropes that I enjoy quite a bit, and tropes that I like to use or really enjoy. They tend to also be the tropes I kind of talk a bit less in for whatever reason. So I really have no idea as to how long this video is going to be. Um, this actually is going to be an episode where I don't talk about Star Wars because there isn't a cursed artifact in Star Wars. At least in canon. I don't remember any being in Rebels or Clone Wars. So far, none in the live action stuff. Or was there one in Clone Wars or Rebels? There might have actually been one in Rebels. No, I think there was one in Rebels. I don't know if I'd count it though. I don't know if I'm counting it. Um, my dog barked. Is he gonna keep barking? No. But yeah, let's just go ahead and dive straight into it.
This video was sponsored by Campfire, guaranteed not to fuse itself to your hand and or whisper dark forbidding secrets in your ear.
It's so crazy how long Campfire has actually been around. I remember watching YouTube back in the day when Campfire ads started to be sponsorship started to show up among YouTubers and stuff like that. It's crazy how far they've come. They deserve it. I think I've never used the software myself, but mainly because I don't think it would actually really be helpful for my approach to writing, so I just don't use it. But I think I could definitely see it being very useful for other people. Um, yeah, Campfire is probably one of the only companies out there that I have one of the only companies that go out and sponsor people that I have no problem like just talking about here. Like most of the time, what you guys see me do is I kind of just skip over them, because it's like they're not paying me or whatever, you know. But Campfire, I give a pass. Campfire, I have no problem. Campfire, I'll give free fucking shout out to because it's a writing software. It's a good one, I think. Anyways.
A while back, I did a trope talk on MacGuffins, and part of my thesis in that video was
Alright, we
that the
did watch
term
the
MacGuffin
MacGuffin
gets
one,
bandied
so.
about a little more than it should, and applied to stuff it doesn't actually describe. Sometimes it almost gets treated as a synonym for plot device, a category of objects that exist to drive the plot in specific directions, but technically MacGuffins are just a subcategory of plot device. Specifically, MacGuffins are plot devices that only drive the plot by being wanted, with no other factors playing into their role in the story. But MacGuffins have something of an evil twin, a plot device that resembles them superficially, but drives the plot through some internal malevolence that corrupts the story around them. Instead of being a thoroughly passive player in the narrative, these plot devices are active and antagonistic.
And that right there, I would call the difference between a MacGuffin and a cursed artifact. Or well, what essentially that sentence there pretty much covers what a MacGuffin is. MacGuffin is a thing that passively influences the plot. It really doesn't, like, you can swap out the object for anything and it's still going to serve the same purpose or whatever. Cursed artifact is a very specific thing and it is very actively moving the plot. A MacGuffin doesn't move the plot. Getting the MacGuffin is essentially the plot, but it doesn't do, and like it's not the focus, I think I would say. Why are we talking about MacGuffins? Like when you're writing a MacGuffin, a story with a MacGuffin, at least in my eyes, for it to be a good story with a MacGuffin, is that the MacGuffin cannot be the point of the story. The point of the story is the things that happen surrounding, right, in pursuit of that MacGuffin, right? The character development, that sort of thing. With a cursed artifact, the character's relationship to that plot device is important and does need to be, you know, it cannot be treated the same way.
I am, of
I don't know
course,
if that makes
referring
any
to the
sense.
trope of the cursed artifact. Cursed artifacts are a very common and extremely old plot device. They show up sporadically in Greek mythology and much more frequently in Norse mythology, where you can't go 10 feet without tripping over a cursed ring or a sword or a necklace or something. So suffice to say that this trope has some staying power. The base concept is very simple.
An object that produces some kind of negative impact on the people around it. Specific effect and radius of impact vary. Sometimes the effect is a vague, it makes bad stuff happen dealio, but others are more specific / malevolent. I had a sort of what was supposed to be like a sort of cursed artifact, though it wasn't really cursed. It was supposed to be something that essentially would be a stand-in for power corrupts. It was supposed to be very blatant, like, this is an object that gives more power and thus power corrupts sort of message. In the very first draft of the first book that I wrote, all the way back, I started writing that bitch back in 2020 when I started writing that. And then I fucking scrapped that idea pretty fucking quick. Or well, in 2022 when I rewrote the story essentially, like the story completely changed from that first draft to what was technically the second draft. Um, I got rid of that fucking object. It was not working. Essentially, what it was supposed to have, because I have no problem talking about this because I think it's a bad idea. Maybe someone could make it. Maybe someone better than me can make it work. I don't really. I look back on it, I'm like, oh nah, that's not my vibe of sort of storytelling with a cursed artifact. But what it was supposed to be, it was supposed to be like essentially like a palantir, um, that holds all of the knowledge and sort of like and their the power of the previous like powerful magic users of this kingdom, um and of the empire that had come before. So it was an artifact that stretched like a few hundred years. um and yeah, it was supposed to essentially be a thing that makes uh um this character really strong magically, essentially like a fucking walking nuke. Or well, essentially he could become like a nuke or whatever. But yeah, I didn't really explore it too far. I ended up scrapping that draft of the book like at 44,000 words before I started rewriting it, and taking it in a completely different direction, which I think was the right choice. Uh, I can't even remember what like my original end goal for that thing was. I don't think I really had one. I would think I was just like, I need a magic artifact that makes my guy stronger. One of my protagonist / antagonist. He wasn't the main character. He was like the brother to the main character. But yeah, it was not did not vibe.
Cursed artifact is an object that has some kind of negative effect on the people around it. The exact effect and the radius can vary. Some cursed artifacts only affect the person who owns them, while others radiate a highly rancid vibe that makes everything around them progressively worse. Cursed artifacts often function by tempting or encouraging the wielder's darker impulses, but sometimes they're a little more brute force and just make bad stuff happen around them, like they radiate bad luck. Cursed artifacts are frequently acquired by protagonists, at which point they become a problem. The plot is often driven, at least in part, by the protagonist's need or desire to get rid of the cursed artifact, often in opposition to a usually curse-driven need or desire to keep it. Now, the nature of the quote-unquote curse can vary a lot. Some cursed artifacts are explicitly magically cursed by some kind of supernatural effect, but some are more like radioactive or infectious or otherwise dangerous in a much more mundane and physical way. And the nature of the artifact and the curse determines a lot about the role it can play in the story. For instance, some cursed artifacts are sentient, either haunted by some
Cursed artifact with a mind of its own that actively compels the wielder to further its goals, often functionally a character in its own right, frequently a weapon, often a sword. In extreme cases can function as a superpowered evil side for the wielder. This works, I don't know how well, I haven't read one where this is done in actually a book yet. I haven't come across it, but in D&D, I think use this one. This one's fucking funny. this one can be fucking great. Like, especially if you have a player that's like Grog or just Travis Willingham in general at your table. Give that player, give the Travis of your table a fucking sentient sword because it's going to be fucking comedic. It's going to be a great ass time. Um, in a book, I don't think it'd work as well. I don't think. I don't. I mean, I could see it working similarly, like how they handle the cursed sword in the Legend of Vox Machina animated show compared to how they handled it in the tabletop. I think they're doing a pretty good job of it on the show. Um, Although it doesn't, I will say, I don't know if it's because it's just like I've seen it before, right? I saw it on the live show. Um, I don't, right? So like seeing it again, but on animated, maybe it's just not hitting the same, or maybe it's just because of this art subtype of the cursed artifact just doesn't translate as well to a scripted show like that. Um, but in role play sort of thing, I think it'd be a good time. Um, but yeah,
Some malevolent entity or being a malevolent entity in their own right. It's
like
most
I think in term like when it comes to like write a novel or a movie, scripted things, um, I think this it falters because it could end up feeling like just repetitive sort of relationship. I think it could easily fall into that. But like when like the role play it's different. I don't know. It makes sense up here. I don't know if the words coming out are making sense.
most common for sentient artifacts to be actively malicious, although it's technically not necessary. In rare cases, the artifact's personality might be totally chill, but the effect it has on the people around it is still generally negative, which is often what happens when the cursed artifact is technically a person. Consider how writers often frame Helen of Troy, a woman whose beauty was so ridiculously over the top that her abduction triggered a 10-year war that she was constantly blamed for despite having no active part in the proceedings. Her beauty is literally treated like a curse. Anyway, that aside, sentient malevolent artifacts are pretty dangerous. They frequently whisper dark, corruptive truths into the ear of the wielder to try and push them into more evil. They also often act on their own. Cursed swords are especially bad about this and will frequently jerk around and try to stab people on their own with minimal input from the wielder. In extreme cases, sentient artifacts might try to take over the user and function as a superpowered evil side. These things are extremely common in settings like D&D and are also fairly common in the broader space of fantasy literature where they are almost always specifically swords. Depending on the moral standing of the wielder, dealing with these things can be pretty tricky. More morally upstanding wielders generally don't like using them at all, but they might be magically bound to the artifact and unable to get rid of it. In other cases, the wielder might not approve of the artifact's attitude, but needs their power for whatever reason. In more morally dubious cases, the wielder and the artifact might get along fine, most common with villains for obvious reasons. An excellent example of this kind of cursed artifact is the demon sword Stormbringer from the Elric Saga, a series of classic fantasy novels written by the excellently named Michael Moorcock. Stormbringer is a fun case because it is an extremely evil weapon. It's literally an actual demon that drains people's souls out through a single cut and uses them to fortify its wielder. The wielder in question is the protagonist Elric, a chronically ill and ultimately good-hearted
Oh, he is zesty. I mean, look at how he's posing. That's a zesty protagonist right there.
guy who unfortunately has to use Stormbringer as basically a mobility aid since the evil power-up is significantly
Oh, I just realized. Well, would so spoilers for Words of Radiance. Stormlight Archives Words of Radiance book 2. It is as far as I have gone so far. So please do not spoil anything. Well, I think I've kind of had some. Don't spoil, please. But Kaladin's relationship with Syl, she becomes a weapon, a sword, or well, a spear. She can transform to a spear or a sword, depending on what Kaladin wants or whatever. I think. Is she technically a cursed artifact? And the vibe I'm getting that perhaps there are other weapons like Syl that may be bad. Therefore, maybe I guess Sanderson is writing a form of this that does work in novels. I just didn't realize it. Meh.
more accessible than the medicine he'd have to take otherwise. The idea of swords that are actually demons is actually pretty popular in non-Tolkien classic fantasy. The concept also shows up in Larry Niven's short story Not Long Before the End, where the demon sword actively vampirizes the life force of the wielder, who can't put it down because the demon is biting their hand. Now, some cursed artifacts aren't
non-sentient but corruptive. A cursed artifact without an obvious will of its own, no voice for instance, that works by passively corrupting people via bad vibes. Might still serve an entity's will, but cannot or will not do much directly on its own. Mostly works by encouraging negativity, and the wielder can be resisted by heroic. Technically, based upon the second definition there, this, if she applies this to the One Ring, that is wrong, because it is, the ring itself is actually doing everything directly of its own. It is making choices based on how it feels it can best get back to Sauron, from my understanding of how the One Ring works based on the movies and reading the books.
Technically sentient on their own, but are still corruptive in a passive way, encouraging bad impulses and negativity in the
But of course,
wielder.
that is
They
my
don't abruptly
interpretation.
flip a
Maybe I'm wrong.
morality switch or anything, but they usually push the character emotionally. It's fairly common for wielders to feel more tired and angry to encourage them to lash out at the people around them, for instance. Now, it might be more accurate to say these cursed artifacts aren't obviously sentient. They frequently display some kind of agenda, often in service of a large-scale villain they belong to, but they tend to be fairly passive in the story itself and don't display the kind of agency we expect from a sentient cursed artifact. These artifacts won't unexpectedly swing around and decapitate anyone, but they will slowly and insidiously encourage the darker impulses of the wielder and turn them into a worse version of themselves. They won't take over the character, but they'll try and wear them down. This is arguably the category the One Ring falls into.
I hope you place the caveat that the One Ring does actually have a will of its own, and that it does purely desire to go back to Sauron. Right? That is the ring's will, is to just get back to Sauron. But right, like, that is still its own will and not the will of its owner.
Sure, it serves a dark master with a powerful will of his own, but the ring itself can't do much beyond bounce in inconvenient directions. The insidious nature
It is not bouncing in inconvenient directions. It is bouncing. Right, like, it grows in size to, like, fall off the ring, fall off the finger of its current wearer, because it is doing that, thinking, this is how I can get back to my master. This is how I can get back to Sauron. As long as the ring works the way that I have heard it works, like, online. That's how my interpretation of the ring, from hearing other Tolkien nerds talk about Tolkien online.
of the One Ring is that even if it doesn't manage to corrupt the wielder within the first minute of contact like it did with the Smeagol, it wears down the willpower of everyone around it, and it's just frankly exhausting to deal with. The effect it has on people can be overt or subtle depending on the individual, and the subtle effects are often significantly more dangerous. And lastly, some cursed artifacts aren't sentient or insidiously corruptive, they're just really bad to be around. They don't tend to have an explicit impact on anyone's moral character, but they do have a tendency to drive them mad or kill them dead. Unexpectedly deadly weapons, barely contained plagues, tomes of forbidden knowledge, and garden variety radioactives all fall into this category. Depending on how unhealthy they are to be around, they might create cursed locations around them, deadly environments warped by the sheer malignance infused into the object itself. Or for, set design. Technically speaking, this category includes almost all mythological cursed artifacts, which didn't tend to be particularly malevolent, but would do things like cause death and misfortune to anyone around them through the power of bad vibes. These cursed artifacts are more karmically unpleasant and cause bad luck or tragedy to follow them around. The most famous of these is probably Andvari's ring, also known as the Ring of the Nibelung, which was stolen from the dwarf Andvari by Loki, causing Andvari to curse it to bring misfortune and death to its owner. Loki handed it off, and it proceeded to do just that, producing the plot of the Ring cycle, and by extension, the one opera everyone knows about. The ring doesn't really do anything, but
the ring does do something in their opera, actually. It allows the wielder to rule the world by controlling the feminine multiplicative power, with something called Liebesverk, a completely normal, not at all deeply weird plot point, which I didn't know because I am not the sort of person who willingly watches opera.
But bad things happen to the people around it. It basically just serves to justify the tragedy happening. Now, it's pretty clear by now that cursed artifacts come in all shapes and sizes, and it makes sense that they can correspondingly play a lot of different narrative roles. At its core, a cursed artifact is nothing more than a source of narrative conflict, and conflict can fit into a story in a lot of different ways. For instance, in some stories, the cursed artifact is in the MacGuffin slot. Everybody wants it, everybody's after it, the curse hopes might even be that everybody wants it and will go to increasingly immoral lengths to get it. In some stories, the fact that the thing is cursed isn't obvious or known, and it is only revealed when they actually find it, producing some complications for the third act. While these cursed artifacts technically still aren't MacGuffins due to their unique properties, in some stories those properties don't actually factor into the story too much, making it kinda functionally a MacGuffin, a pseudo-MacGuffin, if you will. Now in other stories, the cursed artifact is in the inciting incident slot. These stories tend to rely a little more strongly on the actual unique properties of the artifact. Most commonly, the cursed artifact gives a character access to some sort of ability they didn't have before, and the story will dedicate some or all of the plot to exploring the consequences of that. Many of these stories will focus on the protagonist's downward spiral as the cursed artifact corrupts them with power and or evil magic. In some cases, they might even highlight that the artifact doesn't directly affect the character's morality at all, they just let the power get to their head and make them a worse person the regular way. But in some other cases, instead of getting a starting power-up from the artifact, the characters will have to go on some sort of adventure to destroy, contain, or otherwise uncurse the artifact and render it harmless. While some of these stories focus predominantly on the burden of the artifact on the protagonists, in others the main characters might be on the quest because they're uniquely qualified to not be affected by the artifact's curse, and for whatever reason are basically totally cool with it. An extremely pure-of-heart protagonist is common in these stories, and they tend not to focus too hard on the burden of the cursed artifact. This is common in more action-adventure heavy stories. And in contrast, possibly most obviously, in some stories the cursed artifact is in the antagonist slot. Whether the villain of the story is using a cursed artifact, or whether it's arguably the other way round, these stories complicate matters for the heroes by giving the bad guy access to the power of the cursed artifact without the downsides of the cursed part of it. Villains don't tend to worry about being morally corrupted by the stuff they use for evil, so this is a pretty clean way to give the bad guys access to a power-up that the good guys can't use. In fact, some stories will double down and let the villain use the artifact for ludicrously powerful effects because they're on the same page as the cursed artifact rather than resisting it. This is pretty much exclusive to sentient and malevolent cursed artifacts, which are basically just villains in their own right. In some stories they might be being wielded by another villain, but in other stories it might turn out that the artifact was actually the one calling the shots the whole time, and the person who's been swinging it around is just another victim who became fully controlled by it. This doesn't tend to happen with non-sentient cursed artifacts, but you do sometimes get stories where the villain's villainy is in large part motivated.
God, I gotta watch Arcane, man. I hear season 2 got announced. I gotta watch Arcane. I really do. I've been meaning to. I just don't have Netflix. I still don't have Netflix. I gotta catch up on Dragon Prince. I gotta fucking watch. Is the last season of Cobra Kai out yet already? I don't know. That's how far behind. I haven't even watched season 5 of Cobra Kai.
By an obsession with a non-sentient cursed artifact that may or may not be passively corrupting them over time. This is actually pretty common with mad scientist types who see something leaking cursed knowledge and just can't resist poking it with a stick. Now there's a lot of flexibility in this trope, but the nature of the cursed artifact does to an extent determine some key details about the story around it. A cursed sword is probably going to see more combat than a cursed ring, and a cursed artifact whispering dark secrets to the holder is probably going to factor into a plotline about that character either resisting corruption or falling to it, while a passive cursed artifact might be more at home in a plotline about the human corruption of greed. Big dramatic cursed artifacts might be central to a hero's journey type adventure with an epic quest and a grand finale, but smaller, simpler cursed artifacts might be central to small-scale human tragedies where things fall apart due to human nature rather than massive armies of darkness. The most generic kind of cursed artifact is a thing that causes misfortune. This is a pretty basic concept and is very popular in mythology and folklore. It's a fairly all-purpose curse since basically all it does is cause narrative conflict. In some cases, it might not even be explicit that the artifact is at fault in any meaningful way. The bad stuff that happens around it might look like it has more to do with people being greedy jerks than with the artifact in question, which is pretty common in stories where the cursed artifact is just a seemingly mundane treasure, like a stash of gold or a valuable gem that has a reputation for being cursed because people keep murdering each other about it. These artifacts are basically just generic conflict drivers, and in some cases might even be functionally interchangeable pseudo-MacGuffins with no overt cursed properties. But in most stories, the artifact has at least one other property that makes things a little more interesting. For instance, the monkey's paw is a cursed artifact that causes misfortune by granting wishes in the most needlessly unpleasant way possible. It causes misfortune, sure, but the real focus is on the be careful what you wish for message and how getting what you think you want isn't always a good thing. Of course, for a lot of people, the actual takeaway from that story is that you could totally outsmart the asshole wish granter and get everything you want just by being really specific with your wishes. And this is actually a surprisingly common audience response to cursed artifact stories. People love speculating about how they'd handle a cursed artifact. Outsmart it, use it for good, lean into the evil, handle it through sheer heroic gumption, and I honestly can't decide if this is a flaw or
It is so evil it can corrupt even the purest intentions. But I'm different. But I can fix them.
a feature. It feels like a flaw in the writing, because if the point of the story is to highlight that the cursed thingy is bad and never goes well, it seems like if the story does its job right, the audience probably shouldn't conclude that the cursed thingy could go well if they were the one who got it. But on the flip side, I feel like
And this is actually where I think the misconception of the ring comes in, and this is where I think this is the part I get frustrated with book readers, avid book fans of Lord of the Rings that don't like the movies, um, because like people that like I can understand the dislike towards what Peter Jackson decided to do with Denethor. That one dislike of movie Denethor, and how it's not a good representation of the book version. Totally valid, right? Book Denethor is kind of more of a tragic hero. Right? He withstood Sauron for so long, and then, right, and eventually time got to him. He was not able to keep resisting, and his mind like broke or whatever. But with the scope of the movie and the time that they had, I personally think that the uh, portrayal of Denethor and what they decided to do with Denethor makes fucking sense. And then also, I agree as well. I like movie Faramir's use, honestly, probably more so than book, purely based upon how they treat the ring. Book Faramir kind of just doesn't care about the ring, lets it go. And what that does, especially if it doesn't negatively affect the book at all, because the book, by that point in time, we understand that it is a very corruptive power. We understand that point quite well, right? Even though we've had, I think, Aragorn deny it in the books. Does Galadriel deny it? I can't remember. We've had Gandalf reject it, though he does say, if you give it to me, I will blah, 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 or whatever. Did I already say Aragorn? Did Aragorn deny it? If I hadn't already mentioned him. We had Tom Bombadil fucking show up and deny it with ease and kind of just like roast it and be like, this thing's fucking easy. Here you go. Whatever. That works for the book because of the amount of pages and time the book has to tell us about the ring and its corruptive properties. And we can see the effects on like Frodo, Boromir, right? We can see that. In the movie, it would not have worked. If Faramir had done what he did in the books, it would not work. It would actually completely undermine the general audience's perception of the corruptive powers of the ring. We would not be able to buy it. Especially because it happens in that happens in Two Towers, right? Or does it happen in Return of the King? I think it happens in Two Towers, doesn't it? Towards the end, he lets them go, right? Yeah. Yeah, it happens in Two Towers. They get let go by Faramir. But yeah, it wouldn't have worked. It wouldn't have worked. So people that don't like movie Faramir, understand, please, learn the difference and grasp, the differences between the mediums, and that the movie the movie would not have had the time at all to explain to us the right. It would have just been a disconnect there. There would have been a disconnect, and it would not have worked if they had kept Faramir the same as he was in the book, right? Wow.
like that's actually a testament to the allure of the cursed thingy in question, that even an audience with an omniscient perspective on the damage it does can feel tempted to give it their best shot. Is it better to write a cursed artifact so alluring that the audience feels drawn to imagine how it'd work in their hands, or is it better to write a downfall so devastatingly thorough that the audience feels fear and disgust at the cursed thing that caused it? And honestly, I think it depends on the artifact. I don't see anywhere near as many Reddit threads about how people could totally handle the Ring of the Nibelung versus, like, the Death Note. Some cursed artifacts are tempting from both a character and an audience perspective. A cursed murder sword or an evil ring might or might not draw a modern audience's eye, but a wish-granting artifact or an instant kill-anyone button tugs at the imagination. And if the writer gets the audience thinking, hey, maybe it would be cool to have this thing, imagine the problems it could solve, the writer now has an angle of audience investment they can use to explore that question and theoretically demonstrate why it wouldn't actually give them what they wanted, or that at minimum it wouldn't be worth the personal cost. Of course, the effectiveness of this depends.
Again, this is what she's doing here. She's kind of also subtly, very subtly talking about a change over time of audience interest, right? Because I'd wager, I have no proof of this, but I would wager that the old school mythological kind of first artifact, with it kind of also being like a sword or things like that, is tied to that the people back then would have been like, oh, I would have been able to wield the sword and not be corrupted. I would save my people. I would slay the foul beast or whatever, or fight back the invaders, that sort of thing. At least that's how I interpret it.
On the execution. And again, I can't decide if this is a bug or a feature. If a story about a malignant cursed artifact that explicitly destroys everyone it touches ends with the audience still feeling like they could totally handle it and get it right, that does miss the point of the story, but it also highlights the other point of the story, that the cursed artifact is a temptation that most people can't resist.
I agree with the latter there. I think entirely, like, if your audience is like, oh, I could handle it, you're being proven right. You're being proven right. You have successfully created a very tempting cursed artifact. But of course, I think it depends to a certain degree, right? Like, the only one that, the only argument that shows up in regards to Tolkien's One Ring is, why didn't they just fly the birds and then the eagles? And of course, there's an easy like way to say why the eagles couldn't have taken them, and blah blah blah. But right, that's like the right, as long as the audience isn't constantly coming up with a wide variety of different and somewhat valid reasons to handle your cursed artifact, as long as that's not happening, I think you've written a good cursed artifact.
Even from behind the fourth wall. The Monkey's Paw story is a fun little vignette about an asshole wish granter that interprets every wish in the most actively harmful way possible, but we really only see it used 3 times. First, the users wish for a little bit of money, which they get as compensation for the horrible death of their son. Then one of them wishes for the son to come back, but it's heavily implied that he doesn't get unmangled in the process, so the third wish puts him back in the grave permanently. This highlights that the Monkey's Paw is a dick, but it also teases the imagination because it doesn't cover a lot of bases. Maybe if you wished for a lot of money from a highly specific source, you'd be fine, right? Or wished someone back from the dead but completely healed from what killed them. Maybe if you got a lawyer to go over your wishes for you first, you could make sure they were loophole free. The appeal of a wish-granting artifact is obvious, but this kind of thing even happens with stories where the cursed artifact doesn't actually seem all that useful or appealing to an outside audience. People love coming up with other simpler ways the Fellowship could have destroyed the One Ring. Personally, I'm partial to the Legolas ties it to an arrow and fires it into Mount Doom solution, but that's not really the point. Even in a story where the cursed artifact doesn't really tempt the audience's imagination on its own, there's still a temptation to outsmart the story and the characters in it. Things could have been fine if the characters just did this one thing or made this one choice. And this phenomenon is not limited to cursed artifact stories, but it does crop up in them a lot, because frequently cursed artifacts lead characters to make questionable decisions. The corruptive ones actively push characters towards evil, while the misfortune ones just make bad stuff happen around them, often because the characters make questionable decisions. And anytime a character makes a choice the audience knows is bad, it's natural for the audience to think about how things would have turned out if they'd made a different choice instead. And this ties back into something I touched on in the Trope Talk on tragedies. A huge factor in tragedies is that the nature of the characters makes the tragedy inevitable. The decisions the character would make because of who they are as people brings them into conflict and leads to disaster. In many cursed artifact stories, the artifact is just a catalyst for that kind of conflict. It might push the character to make a bad decision, but not an out-of-character decision. A cursed artifact in this kind of story is just a crystallized bad situation that puts the characters into a context where their traits become flaws. The cheerful, humble couple that gets the Monkey's Paw make a simple wish for a small sum of money and their life crumbles around their ears. The people powerful and heroic enough to quickly and efficiently destroy the One Ring are the same people most susceptible to its temptations to use it for the good of the world. The person wielding the actively...
And that is why I fucking love Lord of the Rings is so fucking cleverly written, man. It is so well like it it doesn't really have a plot hole. It doesn't like like the One Ring and really a lesser writer, they'd be full of plot holes. But because of the way Tolkien wrote it, and perhaps because he was the first to write it this way, um, it right it answers itself. The questions that you have in how to solve the One Ring, the answers can be found in the text. They can be found
The
there.
malevolent demon
Or maybe not outright stated. You can heavily infer like why this would not work.
Blade Stormbringer is so frail and sick that he's only capable of doing good or doing anything because of the power that evil sword provides, so he concludes his only option is to use the sword or be useless himself. The idea that someone else might have had better luck with the cursed artifact is a reasonable conclusion in many cases because so many cursed artifacts play to the specific nature of the character dealing with them, and sometimes that's even explored in story. Hell, even in Lord of the Rings, where they go out of their way to explain that the ring can get into anyone's head and tempt them with their greatest desire or whatever, when it tries to get Sam on its side, it literally can't figure out what he wants, because the ring is very grandiose in its temptations, and Sam's not interested in a garden the size of a city. He just wants one small enough for him to tend. The ring might have been able to wear him down eventually, but it was not going to be easy. And there are plenty of stories that actively play into this. Sometimes a cursed artifact starts out with a hero and has a terrible time trying to corrupt them because of their dang heroic gumption, only to later jump ship and end up with a villain who has exactly no problem embracing the dark side and is significantly easier to corrupt and control. Sometimes the cursed artifact actively selects for people who are vulnerable to it and never deals with anyone who could use it responsibly. But sometimes the story takes a slightly different angle. The cursed artifact will corrupt anyone who uses it, but the real measure of narrative heroism is who wouldn't be willing to use it. Maybe the monkey's paw can be outsmarted, but the gist of the story seems to be that anybody who uses it will suffer, no matter how clever they try to be. So the only way to win is not to play. The reason Sam doesn't get corrupted or tempted by the ring is because it has nothing he wants, and thus he has no desire to use it. In these stories, instead of any one bad decision messing up their chance to use the artifact responsibly, the character dooms themselves by choosing to use the artifact at all. This can be difficult to convince an audience of, since the story can only present examples of characters who were beaten by the artifact, and the audience's temptation to outsmart them can be bolstered by knowing where those characters went wrong. But honestly, feature or flaw, I don't think this is a bad thing. It's just a very specific way for the audience to critically engage with the story, and that's always fun. It's not the writer's job to convince the audience of anything, even the moral of their own story. They just gotta tell it. So, yeah. And thanks again to Campfire.
And that was Trope Talk Cursed Artifacts. This was, again, another fantastic job by Red. Yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't say there was anything missing here. I would have liked more discussion around the One Ring, though. I think we could have certainly dived rather deeply into that. But it's the way the cookie crumbles, I guess. I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.